2,000 years ago, blacksmiths in southern India made a steel so advanced that when scientists finally put it under an electron microscope in 2006, they found carbon nanotubes inside it. One of the strongest materials ever measured were created 20 centuries before anyone knew atoms existed. This steel was harder than anything Europe could produce, yet it bent without breaking. Blades forged from it could slice a silk scarf in mid-air. And when Alexander the Great arrived in India in 326 BC, the gift he valued above gold and jewels was 2.5 tons of this metal. By 1800, the technique for making it had completely vanished. For the next 200 years, it defeated every scientist who tried to crack it, including Michael Faraday, 300 experiments at the Paris Mint, and a metallurgist who spent 20 years of his career on nothing else before he finally found the answer hiding in an impurity so small that nobody had thought to measure it. This is the story of Wootz steel, how it was made in sealed clay crucibles over 2,000 years ago, what modern science has found hidden inside its structure at the nanometer scale, and why, despite every tool available to 21st century metallurgy, we have never fully replicated the original process. What it actually was. Europeans called it Damascus steel, but that name is misleading because Damascus never produced a single gram of it. Every ingot came from southern India, from regions like Tamil Nadu, Karnataka, and Telangana, where craftsmen had been making this metal since at least the 3rd century BC. Europeans simply called it Wootz, a corruption of uku, the South Indian word for steel. If you held a Wootz ingot in your hand, it would feel like a small, dense cake of metal, roughly the size and shape of a hockey puck, weighing between 0.5 kilogram and 2 kilograms. If you were to cut one in half, it would reveal a distinctive branching pattern frozen in place from when the molten steel solidified. Here is what made Wootz different from every other steel on Earth. Carbon. Ordinary bloomery iron, the kind European blacksmiths worked with for most of the medieval period, contained less than 0.5% carbon, whereas Wootz contained between 1 and 2%. That difference is enormous because carbon is what makes steel hard, and steel with 1.5% carbon is far harder than steel with 1/3%. On the other hand, the harder you make steel, the more brittle it becomes, meaning steel that hard should shatter on impact like glass, and a sword made from it should snap the first time it hits a shield. Wootz, however, did not shatter, and this contradiction mystified every scientist who studied it for 200 years. The steel was harder than it had any right to be, yet it remained flexible enough to forge into thin sword blades that could absorb the shock of combat without cracking. When those blades were polished and etched with mild acid, the surface revealed the visible watered pattern, alternating bands of light and dark steel flowing across the blade like ripples on a pond. This was not decoration, but the visible signature of the metal's internal structure. The 12th century Arab geographer Al-Idrisi put it simply: the Indians excelled in the manufacture of iron, and it was impossible to surpass the edge from Indian steel. So why did this matter so much? Because Wootz solved a problem that no other civilization on the planet had solved. In metallurgy, hardness and toughness are natural enemies. The harder you make steel, the more brittle it becomes. The tougher you make it, the softer the edge. Every European swordsmith in the medieval period was forced to compromise between these two properties. The best they could achieve was a blade with a hard edge and a softer spine. Wootz did not compromise. It was both. And the blades forged from it dominated warfare across the Middle East for roughly 11 centuries. By the late 1600s, tens of thousands of Wootz ingots were crossing the Arabian Sea every year. The Persian phrase for cutting someone with an Indian sword was to give an Indian answer. That's how feared this material was. the reach extended far beyond the Middle East. The famous Ulfbert swords of the Viking era, dating from the 8th to the 11th century, were forged from imported crucible steel that likely originated in Persia or India. Their purity and performance were so far ahead of anything available in Europe at the time that some historians have described them as the assault rifles of the Viking Age. And Wootz was not just a weapon material. The forging process itself required extraordinary skill that took years to master. Syrian swordsmiths had to work the metal at temperatures between 650 and 850 degrees Celsius, or 1202 and 1562 degrees Fahrenheit, that had to be low enough to preserve the internal banding structure, but high enough to shape the blade. The best ancient blades show carbide band spacing of 60 to 70 micrometers. Modern smiths are only now learning to match that precision. This was a strategic resource that shaped trade routes, military outcomes, and the balance of power across 3 continents for over 1,000 years. So how did Indian blacksmiths solve a problem that stumped every other civilization on Earth? The answer starts with a clay pot, some charcoal, and a single ingredient so small it would take 200 years of modern science to find it. The science. Indian metallurgists started with either bloomery iron or magnetite ore and packed it into small clay crucibles along with a carbon source. It was typically wood chips from specific trees or bamboo charcoal, and sometimes leaves from particular plants. These crucibles were sealed with a clay lid to create an airtight chamber and placed inside a charcoal furnace. And here's a detail that matters. In some regions, the furnaces were not driven by bellows. They were driven by monsoon winds. Archaeologist Gil Juleff documented this in a landmark paper published in Nature. Other sites, like those sketched by Francis Buchanan during his travels in 1807, used bellows made of buffalo hide. Either way, the engineering behind these furnaces was remarkable. It was robust enough to withstand firing cycles of up to 24 hours at extreme temperatures. The furnace was heated to between 1,300 and 1,400 degrees Celsius, or 2,372 and 2,552 degrees Fahrenheit, and held there for up to a full day. During that time, the iron absorbed carbon from the organic material, lowered its melting point, and liquefied inside the sealed crucible. Then came the critical part. The crucible was removed and allowed to cool slowly, over several days. That slow cooling allowed the carbon to segregate into distinct zones within the crystal structure, rather than distributing evenly. And this segregation was the foundation of everything that made Wootz special. The final carbon content is between 1 and 1.6%. Modern metallurgists call this ultra-high carbon steel. At that carbon level, the steel should be hopelessly brittle. But Wootz blades were famously flexible, and nobody could explain why. For over 200 years, scientists tried to crack this. Michael Faraday, whose father had been a blacksmith, teamed up with a master cutler named James Stoddart. They added various metals to iron. Nothing worked. At the Paris Mint, a researcher named Briand conducted roughly 300 experiments, adding everything from platinum and gold to uranium. He concluded only that the properties came from carbon, but not how. Then, in the early 1980s, a metallurgist at Iowa State University named John Verhoeven decided to try. Verhoeven partnered with Alfred Pendray, a bladesmith based in Florida, and together they spent over a decade attempting to reproduce authentic Wootz patterns in the laboratory. They failed, repeatedly. They used pure iron-carbon alloys. They adjusted temperatures. They varied cooling rates. The famous watered patterns refused to appear. Year after year, the same result. The steel was just steel. Then Verhoeven switched to a different source of iron, something called sorrel meta. It was a very pure type of iron produced from ilmenite ore deposits on the St. Lawrence River in Canada. and the patterns suddenly appeared. But why? Virchow even ran the analysis, and in 1996 he found it. The sorel metal contained approximately 0.04% vanadium, 40 parts per million, a trace impurity so small that no one in 200 years of study had thought to measure it. That tiny amount of vanadium turned out to be the entire secret. Here's what it did. When the Wootz ingot cooled after smelting, the vanadium atoms, along with other trace elements like molybdenum and chromium, were pushed out of the solidifying iron crystals. They accumulated along the boundaries between crystal grains, forming thin sheets running through the steel. When the ingot was later heated and hammered into a blade, these impurity-rich zones acted as nucleation sites, places where an extremely hard compound called iron carbide or cementite clustered preferentially. The result was alternating bands of carbide-rich and carbide-poor steel running through the blade. The hard bands gave it its edge. The softer bands gave it flexibility. And when the surface was etched, those bands produced the famous watered pattern. But the vanadium was only half the story. Because when another team of scientists looked even closer, what they found inside Wootz steel should not have been possible. In 2006, a research team led by Marianne Riebold and Peter Pölfler at the Technische Universität Dresden in Germany got their hands on a section of a 17th century Damascus sabre. The blade had been made by the famous smith Assad Ullah, and it was donated by the Bern Historical Museum in Switzerland. They dissolved a piece of the blade and examined it under a transmission electron microscope. Inside the steel, they found carbon nanotubes, cylinders of single-atom-thick carbon with a diameter of roughly half a nanometer, enclosing nanowires of cementite. Their findings were published in Nature. The nanotubes appear to have formed because the trace impurities, the vanadium, the molybdenum, the chromium, catalyzed the growth of carbon structures during the repeated heating and cooling cycles of forging. And these nanotubes may explain how the steel achieved its impossible combination of extreme hardness and resilience, because carbon nanotubes are among the strongest materials ever measured by modern science. How it changed life. Wootz steel reshaped the power dynamics of the medieval world. Before Wootz reached the Middle East through Indian Ocean trade, Arab and Persian armies relied on locally produced bloomery steel that was functional but ordinary. Once Wootz ingots began arriving in quantity, however, the quality of weapons in the Islamic world jumped dramatically, and Damascus became a center of blade production not because it had iron ore or any natural metallurgical advantage, but because it sat at the crossroads of trade routes carrying Wootz from India. The city's smiths then developed specialized forging techniques to work the difficult high-carbon ingots into the curved blades that became their signature. From there, the technology spread outward rapidly. By the 8th century, Wootz forged blades dominated Islamic weaponry, and by the 10th century, Silk Road networks carried both the steel and the knowledge into Central Asia and China. Even the Viking world may have been touched by Wootz, since the famous Ulfberht swords produced between the 9th and 11th centuries contain unusually pure steel with very low slag content. Some researchers believe these blades were forged from imported crucible steel, possibly Wootz, that travelled through Persian and Russian trade networks northward into Scandinavia. A high-quality Wootz Damascus sword was not a common soldier's weapon, but a marker of status, wealth and power, with historical accounts suggesting that a finely crafted Wootz blade could cost as much as 3 elephants. Rulers presented them as diplomatic gifts. Warriors passed them down through generations, and the swords that Indian Rajas sent to the Great Exhibition in London in 1851 were decorated with jewels, though the exhibitors made clear that the blades were prized above all for the quality of the steel itself. If this steel was this good for this long, then the obvious question is, why did it disappear? Three forces killed it. The first force arrived in 1740 when English watchmaker Benjamin Huntsman developed a crucible steel process using coke-fired furnaces that could produce consistent, high-quality steel in larger quantities than the Indian process ever managed. By the late 1700s, European crucible steel was being manufactured at industrial scale, and although it lacked the banding or the nanostructure of Wootz, it was good enough for tools, springs, clock mechanisms, and machine parts while costing a fraction of the price. The economics shifted permanently because there was no longer any reason to import small expensive ingots from halfway around the world when you could make serviceable steel locally in bulk. The second force was geological. Verhoeven and Pendray's research demonstrated that the famous Damascus pattern depended on trace impurities in the original Indian ore, specifically vanadium at concentrations as low as 40 parts per million. Only certain deposits in certain regions produced steel that could develop the characteristic carbide banding, and when those specific deposits were mined out or became inaccessible through political disruption, the raw material for true Wootz disappeared along with them. Smiths may have continued making crucible steel, but the blades stopped showing the pattern, and without the pattern there was no Damascus steel. The third force was the gun. By the 18th and 19th centuries, firearms had replaced swords as the primary weapon of war across most of the world, collapsing the demand for ultra-high-quality blade steel. Trade routes that once carried tens of thousands of Wootz ingots per year went quiet, and Indian craftsmen who had passed the knowledge through families for generations found no buyers. The answer is not that we found something better in every respect, but that we found something cheaper and faster. And in the process, we lost a material that modern laboratories are still working to understand. As Verhoeven himself noted, while Wootz's legendary reputation for being superior to all modern steel is overstated, the material was genuinely better than anything else available before the 1800s. And the combination of properties it achieved through its nanostructure remains remarkably difficult to replicate even with modern equipment. Modern revival? Not everything was lost. The partnership between Verhoeven and Pendray, which lasted from the early 1980s through the 2000s, succeeded in producing Wootz blades with patterns that were microscopically and visually identical to ancient Damascus blades. Pendray continues making Wootz in Florida, although he produces fewer than 20 blades per year because the process is extremely labor-intensive and expensive. Other specialist smiths, including Rick Furrer and Ulrich Hennecker, have also successfully produced authentic Wootz steel, and Pendray's work attracted the attention of King Abdullah II of Jordan, whose royal smiths travelled to Pendray's workshop in Florida to learn the technique. Meanwhile, researchers at the Central Iron and Steel Research Institute in Beijing are using computational metallurgical software to model the banding mechanism, while researchers in Sweden have produced experimental knife blades. The Wallace Collection in London is studying genuine Damascus blades using neutron diffraction analysis, and in India, the National Institute of Advanced Studies in Bangalore continues documenting the archaeological evidence of the industry that started it all. In theory, the materials needed to make Wootz are simple: iron, carbon, a clay crucible, and a hot enough fire. In practice, however, the process is extraordinarily difficult because the temperature must reach above 1,300 degrees Celsius or 2,372 degrees Fahrenheit. The carbon content must land in a narrow range, the cooling must be slow and controlled, and without the right trace elements in your iron, you may produce crucible steel but never achieve the banding. Rick Furrer's 50% success rate on forging alone tells you how unforgiving the material remains even for an expert. A Wootz ingot sits in the Victoria and Albert Museum in London, looking like a rough lump of dark metal weighing about a kilogram, and most visitors walk past it without a second glance. Inside that lump, however, is a nanostructure that modern materials science is still working to fully understand and reliably replicate. We just forgot to ask how it worked before we threw it away. If you are learning something from this, hit that like button and subscribe, because it helps us share this forgotten knowledge with more people who care about what our ancestors actually built. Drop a comment and tell us what other lost materials or technologies we should investigate next. Subscribe and let's keep investigating.